Before the scramble for Africa, when European powers plundered the African continent for its resources, Western education in Africa was limited to the coastal enclaves controlled by Europeans. Fura Bay College was one of the schools that pioneered Western education in Africa. It was established by the Church Missionary Society in 1826 in Freetown, Sierra Leone, for the purpose of training the children of freed African slaves as schoolmasters, catechists, and clergymen. After the colonial conquest, the colonial state and Christian missionaries played a decisive role in promoting Western education. A notable consequence of the European imperial hegemony was the rise to prominence of colonial languages such as French, English, Portuguese, German, Italian, and Spanish, which put an end to centuries of quasi-monopoly of Arabic as the language of schooling, administration, and diplomacy on the African continent, correlated with the introduction of Western-type schooling in the Muslim world, where the promotion of the Latin script and the relative marginalization of the Arabic script. This was not just true for colonies of Europe. In Turkey, for example, which had never been colonized, the Muslim leader Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, in his attempt to modernize his country, decreed that the Turkish language should no longer be transcribed with the Arabic script but with the Latin script. This led to the abandonment of a system of transmission that had dominated one of the most powerful empires in world history. Indeed, the Ottoman Empire lasted several centuries, including virtually all of the Arab world and the Balkans, in addition to Anatolia, in its sphere of domination and influence, and left a legacy of tens of millions of Turkish language documents written in the Arabic script as its historical archive. In West Africa, the colonial states, particularly in English-speaking countries, also tried to promote the Latin script to transcribe indigenous languages. In northern Nigeria, for example, the British favored the use of the Latin script to transcribe Hausa. Hausa was the language of the army in the sense that commands were given in Hausa. To get a promotion, all British administrators who were indigenous Africans had to speak Hausa and pass an exam. As a result, Hausa has been taught for decades using the Latin script. Educated Nigerian Hausa speakers have developed the ability to write elaborate academic literature in the Hausa language with the Latin script. Newspapers, magazines, and academic books in Hausa printed in the Latin script have been and are quite common in Nigeria today. As part of the colonial restructuring of knowledge transmission, major transformations affected the material culture of learning in the Bilad Sudan or Sub-Saharan Africa. First, the wooden tablets and the locally manufactured inks used for centuries became restricted to traditional Quranic schools. Instead, pupils in Western-type schools used exercise books and pencils and pens, and instructed used chalk to write on a blackboard. Introduced in large numbers in Western schools, printed books in Western languages were widely disseminated and available to students in areas where books had hitherto existed essentially in manuscript form. Likewise, a number of Arabic texts printed by the Egyptian printing press, Bulaq, also known as El Meriya Press, were being imported in West Africa and circulated in Arabophone circles starting in the 1920s. The organization of learning was also transformed. In the two-tier Islamic education, schools did not always have their own premises, and students typically shared the same space regardless of their level of learning or age. Western-type schools dedicated classroom space for each age grade. In primary, middle, and high school, students in each grade were of the same age and had very little age differences. The recruitment of students also differed in the two education systems. We have already seen that in the Islamic system, parents typically surrendered their child to a Quranic schoolmaster who might be a nomad or a sedentary from the same area or from a distant local or country. Islamic higher education students traveled far away to study a specific text of a sheikh or an expert. At best, they might bring in their bags a recommendation from a respected sheikh testifying to their piety or morality, but there was no formal registration process. In contrast, in Western-type schools, clear guidelines determined school enrollment. Factors such as age, nationality, residential location, sound physical and mental health, and intellectual qualification governed the recruitment of students, which was impersonal. Parents had to submit an application showing that their child fulfilled all of these requirements. Transfer students took necessary tests to evaluate their qualifications prior to enrollment. The certification of education was also different. Unlike in a madrasa where a sheikh delivered an ijaza, written or oral, to a student to certify his completion of a specific text and authorized him to teach it, Western type schools organized exams and delivered degrees with the label of the school, certifying a general qualification based on the study of a variety of subjects. In other words, the General Certificate of Education in English-speaking and French-speaking countries, for example, as indicated by its name, is a certification by the State Department of Education of the successful completion of high school studies, not an authorization to teach a specific book of, say, Aristotle, Avicenna, or even philosophy in general. In the Islamic system, instructors taught orally in mosques or in studies inside their own homes. Students in their inner circles served as their assistants and could access their master's libraries. There was no formal school administration or school library in the Bilad Sudan. By contrast, Western type schools had their own premises with offices for members of the administration and also library holdings. In the Islamic system, the teacher is typically self-employed. Students provided agricultural labor in rural areas to help feed the community. But the labor of a student, it must be noted, was part of the educational process and not simply a form of compensation for the master. Occasionally, parents offered grain, meat, or cash to the master, but this hardly covered the needs of the school or of the master. Thus, teachers devised various ways of supporting the school, including sending students to appeal for community solidarity, begging, offering for a fee, various religious services such as marriage, naming, and funeral ceremonies, and provided talismans or prayers for people into a new house. In contrast, teachers in Western type schools received a regular salary. Their career was governed by an impersonal system that included evaluation of performance, provision of pedagogical training destined to improve teaching skills, career advancements, and, of course, salary increases based on seniority and or performance. Within this system, a bureaucracy exercised disciplinary power over students and instructors. It defined clearly what would and would not be allowed. In the Islamic school system, by contrast, the schoolmaster exercised his personal role. Although Islamic ethics provided an overall foundation for the transmission of knowledge and a good reputation helped in raising demand in school enrollments, nobody monitored the schoolmaster to evaluate his performance. As noted by a well-known Arabic writing, the basic rule was a stick for disobedient students. In contrast, physical punishment tended to be banned in the Western school system, although the ban was not always effective. The colonial education system brought a much larger corpus of books to pupils than had the historical core curriculum. Compared with a corpus limited to religious texts, readers now had access to a large variety of texts dealing with more topics. A similar transformation has been documented in the West in the 18th century following the invention of the printing press and the Protestant Reformation. Before the reading revolution, readers had access to a limited number of texts, which were read, reread, memorized, and recited, deeply understood and possessed, and transmitted from one generation to another. Religious texts, for the most part, they were imbued with sacrality and venerated. In contrast with this intensive method of reading, a new method of more extensive reading was implemented that included a larger number of texts for which readers had no particular veneration, and which they submitted to analytical scrutiny and methodological doubt. Above all, the epistemological framework of the Islamic school rested on the notion that knowledge must be based on religion and that it helps the believers live a life in conformity with God's commands. Hence, schooling started with the study of Quran, followed by subjects aimed at deepening the understanding of the law based on the Quran. In contrast, the Western type school emphasized the study of subjects not directly related to religion, such as math, physics, chemistry, history, geography, etc. Although these subjects have been known to be studied in the schools of Timbuktu long before the arrival of Europe to the African continent. Even in the Christian missionary schools, which did provide some religious instruction to Christian students, general non-religious subjects formed the core curriculum. The Western type schools introduced a parallel secular framework that will compete with the previously dominant religious one. The response of Muslims to the colonial reorganization of schooling has been of three kinds. A first group opted to send their children to public schools offering instruction in European languages, where they received an education certified by the award of a degree. Among these, the majority arranged for their children to receive some parallel Islamic education. They might either send them to a Quranic school to study a few hours during the weekend or hire a private tutor to initiate them in Quranic studies at home. A second group adopted a learning method inspired largely by Western pedagogy as described earlier, while using either exclusively Arabic or both Arabic and the colonial language as the media of instruction. This trend led to the rise of hybrid schools, called by various names: Islamia schools in northern Nigeria, Franco-Arabic schools in Senegal, and Madrasa in Mali and Mauritania. A third group of Muslims opted to preserve the traditional system and offered only Arabic-based education. This is particularly the case in clerical enclaves that resisted westernization. The different types of schools coincided with different needs. Therefore, they have maintained complex patterns of interactions, and none of these three types of schooling has completely precluded any or all of the others.